Hello.
Hi, I'm Anne, coming live to you from Hong Kong. A very warm welcome to our Singapore speakers and attendees. So both Hong Kong and Singapore are ecosystem leaders in the region, with the respective governments keenly attracting and collaborating with key ecosystem players. Supportive policies, incentives, and dedicated programs contributed to the success of the respective startup ecosystems. As such, these cities are currently enjoying success from access to digital talent, entrepreneurs, and market opportunities. This panel is to facilitate a discussion on policies, incentives, and programs dedicated to nurturing a vibrant ecosystem on each country's journey and future hopes for the local and regional startup landscape. So may I announce our first panel today. The panelists are Mr. Edwin Chow, Assistant CEO of Enterprise SG. Please give him a round of applause in both Singapore and Hong Kong. Dr. Lim Jui, the CEO of SGInnovate. Mr. Stephen Phillips, Director General of InvestHK. And our moderator of today, Mr. Clay Chandler, Asia Executive Editor, Fortune. I will now hand over to our seasoned moderator, Mr. Clay Chandler, please.
Thank you very much. Hello, Singapore. Glad to see that we have our other twin engine functioning in sync with us. Good to see you both. You can hear me, right, Edwin and Dr. Lim?
Yep, we can hear you. No, now we can see it. We can see him in the screen in front of us.
Okay, now we can see you straight ahead.
Great. Well, this is really a pleasure, and thank you for making the time to join with us. I wonder if we could start out by just asking each of you very briefly to describe your role in your organization and how it fits into the strategy for your respective ecosystems. And perhaps, Stephen, maybe I'll start with you.
Great. Well, thank you, Clay, and hello to everybody. So I'm the head of Invest Hong Kong, which is Hong Kong's inward investment agency. So our role is to attract high-quality companies, all the way from multinationals through to startups and entrepreneurs from all around the world, both international and from the mainland. The startup ecosystem is very, very important to our work. As Clay mentioned earlier on, we've got a dedicated startup team. We run a very big Start Me Up Hong Kong festival, as well as lots of work one-to-one with individual companies. But in essence, it's bringing best-of-breed, tech-related companies from all around the world to both create jobs in Hong Kong and add to the overall economic development of the city. Maybe leave it at that for now.
Great. Edwin, maybe we could turn to you next.
Sure, thanks, Clay. Hi, everyone. I'm part of Enterprise Singapore. We're a government agency whose mission is to help Singapore-based companies, SMEs and startups especially, to help them to grow both in Singapore and also to expand overseas. And the second part of the question, how it fits in with the overall strategy. I think if we look at the startup ecosystem, we need a few ingredients. We need talent, people to start companies. We need money, people, venture capitalists, early stage investors, and we need markets. And I think a lot of the work that Enterprise Singapore together with the other both public and private sector entities in Singapore do is to help entrepreneurs access those three things.
Great, thank you, Edwin. Dr. Lim.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jui. I'm the CEO of SGInnovate. SGInnovate is a private limited company, but it's wholly owned by the Singapore government. And our mandate is to develop the deep tech sector of the economy. And we do this in a sort of a triple helix fashion, combination of investment capital, talent development, as well as community building. We focus primarily at early stage startup companies in the deep tech space. And of course, the definition of deep tech, happy to talk about this later, evolves over time. I mean, there's a temporal component to it. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, thank you very much. You know, a moment ago, I was just sort of reflecting on some of the similarities and the differences between Singapore's ecosystem, Hong Kong's ecosystem, but I am increasingly struck, you know, even at the remarks of some of the presenters here, about the ways in which people from Asia generally are finding ways to move well beyond not only their own cities, but the regions that they're typically associated with. And I'd love to get your thoughts a little bit. Maybe Stephen, we'll turn to you first to just kind of reflect on that a bit. Do you see in Hong Kong that this notion of where an ecosystem is, that the boundary is becoming really blurry, and that companies that are in some ways active or involved or headquartered in Hong Kong are really able to access global markets now in a way that they weren't before?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation, this sort of physical versus virtual. And we're seeing more and more companies, certainly in Hong Kong, that are tapping into global opportunities. I think, again, we've heard a lot about pandemic accelerating digitization. And I think that has woken up a lot of companies, the fact that they can actually tackle many more markets if they've got the capital and human resources to do so, just from one location. One example that we're seeing quite a lot here in Hong Kong is the Belt and Road Initiative, which sees the sort of connectivity between Asia and Europe through Central Asia and through the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East. And we're seeing more and more companies seeing the reality of the digital Belt and Road becoming quite feasible. So serving customers, let's say in Kazakhstan from Hong Kong and so forth. So it's becoming easier with technology. But I think the trick for an early stage company, though, is maintaining enough focus so that you're really successful, rather than just diverting resources all over the place and sort of losing the plot.
Edwin, let me put that question to you. It's an interesting one for you because Enterprise Singapore, its mandate is not only to help companies that are based in Singapore, you actively also try to help Singaporean companies no matter where they are. How do you think about this idea of an ecosystem?
Well, that's an interesting point. And Singapore's starting point obviously is our physical constraints, right? I mean, we have the benefit of being well located in a growing region in South and Southeast Asia, but it's also very obvious to all of us here that we are extremely small, both physically as well as in terms of population. This is sort of made worse by the pandemic, where we can't really travel. So if a startup were to succeed or wants to succeed, it's not possible for the founders to just develop a product for a Singaporean market and then do a copy paste. Unlike what you can do in the US, right? You start in Silicon Valley and then you just take the same approach to serve your customers. Doesn't matter whether they're in California or in New York, they're probably the same consumers at this. Likewise, to some extent with China. So from the very beginning, we need to help our companies to really go out, to find the product market fit, to find the right partners that customize their own solutions for the needs of their destination market. And that is why one of the reasons why we launched our what we call the Global Innovation Alliance. This is a network. There's 15 cities now globally, a network of 15 different partners, all of them with very strong connections and expertise in their home markets, able to help coach and advise the startups that participate in these programs how to quickly achieve this product market fit, to find partners, to find talent, to find investors, find customers, etc. So it is something that we sort of live and breathe every day when we work, and it's definitely something that is very close to our hearts and minds.
It's really fascinating. Dr. Lim, you mentioned your effort to promote deep tech. How does this kind of local versus global issue play out in your efforts to bring more deep tech to Singapore?
Thanks, Lei. I think especially in deep tech, the approach is even more global. It is global in a number of ways. if from the standpoint of the substrate where we are creating the companies from, they tend to come from the universities and the research institutes. And the reality in Singapore today is, if you look at our PhD population, the vast majority are actually citizens from other countries who now live and work in Singapore. We also work very closely with Edwin's team to bring individuals from foreign companies, entrepreneurs from other countries, to set up in Singapore. So, there are many reasons, and of course, at the deep tech level, really, the scientist-to-scientist collaborations are not limited by geography, right? I mean, our founders are constantly working with people in the US, in China, in India, in Europe. So, on so many levels, especially in the deep tech space, and we've seen this, of course, with the response to the pandemic. The intelligentsia is global. The scientific intelligentsia is global.
We were mentioning a little bit earlier in our program here that Hong Kong and Singapore are often described as rivals. They constantly kind of have this kind of status competition with each other as cities. That's certainly true in the tech space as well. But I wonder if I could maybe invite all three of you to talk a little bit about the potential for collaboration, because the startup space is not really a zero-sum game. It's got a lot of opportunities for people to work together. These are the two of the most dynamic tech hubs in in Asia, if not the world. Are there more things that Hong Kong and Singapore can do together, and how much collaboration takes place right now, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Clay. And in your opening remarks, you talked about the similarities and the fundamentals, and I think those are very strong indeed. And the sort of theme of this session, this sort of twin engines, also resonates very strongly with me. And the decision for a startup, or indeed a larger company, where to set up and grow is rarely a binary choice between two locations. Normally the major determinant is, where is your market? Where are you going to get the customers that you need as swiftly as possible? And both cities offer routes to substantial markets, not the home cities necessarily, but proximate. Obviously, Hong Kong, geographically located, slap bang in the middle of Asia as a whole, so it opens up the possibilities of the whole landscape. Clearly, being part of China and our proximity to the Greater Bay Area and the mainland, something that sets Hong Kong apart, perhaps. But I believe really strongly that for growth companies, it's an issue of sequencing rather than that simple choice, which lots of commentators seem to like to bring out. In terms of opportunities for collaborations between the cities, I think they exist. Both of our governments want to see companies grow, homegrown companies grow, and that leads to them growing overseas just as much as in the local market. In the case of Hong Kong, our fifth largest source of international investment is from Singapore, a city of very similar size to Hong Kong. And our seventh largest source of startup co-founders from outside Hong Kong is Singapore. So there's already a lot of collaboration and cooperation going on. But fundamentally, I think that cooperation is mostly at the corporate commercial level.
Edwin, how do you see that?
Thanks, Clay. I think this is a topic very close to my heart personally. I think if you think about the journey of a startup, right? I think you can sort of characterize it in a few ways. Number one, it is extremely high risk. I think most of us in this room will know that a typical startup, probably 90% chance of failure in 5 years, right? Number two, a startup requires, in order for it to be successful, there's a saying, right? It takes a village to raise a children. Well, in this case, I think it probably takes half a world to raise a unicorn. If you think about the journeys of some of the unicorns coming out from this part of the world over the past 5 years, the number of countries and companies and investors that have helped them. So you need the concerted effort of a lot of people and partners to really make it successful. And third, it's a long journey, right? And you know, I was reflecting on your headline, the twin engines of Asia's startup ecosystem. It really is a very good metaphor, because I don't know about you, but I would feel very nervous going onto an aeroplane with only one engine on one wing. I think if you want to really succeed and not crash and burn, better to have two. 3 or 4 would be, you know, a bonus, right? So to come back to your point about where we can collaborate, and if you again look at different stages of a startup's journey, if it's right at the beginning, at the early stage, a lot of your efforts, the founder's effort, is really to find a product market fit, right, for the science or the tech that he or she has. And to do that, you need to find the right customers who give you a try. You need to convince your team, right, the founders and people to join you, and then you need VCs. So Hong Kong and Singapore actually has a lot of concentration of all three. Customers, corporates. I mean, Singapore has got 5,000 multinationals that call Singapore a regional headquarters. Hong Kong, I'm sure, the same. If you look at the sources of talent, right, both our cities have got solid, you know, world-class universities with good talent, good professors. It's a talent magnet for our respective zones, right? And we are both financial institutions. So there are, I think, a lot of areas where Singapore companies can tap on Hong Kong corporates as customers, Hong Kong VCs as investors, vice versa, right? Hong Kong founders coming to Singapore to tap the concentration of talent here from all around Southeast Asia. If they want to go into Southeast Asia and win here, they need to start right. So I believe all the ingredients are there. And this is perhaps something that, and maybe one other final point. I mean, we've all read what the mainland, the government wants to do in developing the Greater Bay Area into a sort of a Asian equivalent of the Silicon Valley. And I think all of us here in Singapore would be very interesting to watch how that develops, the role that Hong Kong can play in that, working with Shenzhen and Guangzhou and so on. And I believe that there are plenty of areas that we can collaborate.
That's a great segue to maybe invite you to say a little bit more about the Greater Bay Area and the plan. I mean, specifically for new ventures, what are the opportunities that it presents?
Well, just for those who don't know, the Greater Bay Area is the 2 special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau, plus 9 cities in Guangdong. So the 11 cities are home to 86 million people, with the highest GDP per capita within China. The region home to some of the most innovative mainland Chinese companies, Huawei obviously being one of those, headquartered in Shenzhen. And what you have got is this very densely populated region that's super connected by physical infrastructure, and with the combination of the international nature of Hong Kong, both on the innovation and intellectual property side, but also the international financial services in Hong Kong, combined with the scale of what's going on in the rest of GBA, the ingredients exist to see it become a leading cluster of innovation and financial services globally. So that's sort of the opportunity. The policy environment is changing to ease the movement of people, goods, services and capital within the region to unleash the full potential. But genuinely, I think technology is at the heart of that opportunity. But in essence, it's about scale. It's a significant market. Just to give you a feel, today, the total economy of GBA is about the 10th or 11th largest economy in the world. Most forecasts indicate it could be the 5th or 6th largest economy by 2030. So I just argue it's too big to ignore.
Let me put you on the spot a little bit if I can. Does it worry you? You talked about the roads and physical infrastructure that connect this area, but for a lot of the new ventures in this building at Cyberport, the key issue is data flowing back and forth across borders. And of course, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks, regulators in Beijing are getting very, very firm in scrutinizing the types of data that are allowed to go back and forth across borders. Now, in some ways, that's an advantage has been an advantage for Hong Kong in the sense that companies that might otherwise have tried to rush to list on Wall Street are now finding it much more desirable, easier to list here in Hong Kong. But is it also potentially a disadvantage in terms of starting a new business? And is it hard for businesses here to understand where the kind of rules are in terms of how they can even across from Hong Kong into the greater Bay Area, what kind of data they can move back and forth?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Obviously, the last few weeks has seen data come to the fore in the news. But data actually is a global issue, as we all know. And the extraterritorial effect of data provisions from economies around the world, whether it's the US, GDPR from Europe, Hong Kong's own legislation, the mainland's legislation, are far-reaching already. So I think what's been going on just over the last couple of weeks is just a microcosm of a much bigger issue globally. So I don't think it's particularly unique to what's going on here. I think when we look at the context of the GBA area, I think companies are divided, in all honesty. We see some companies who would prefer to see data ring-fence within Hong Kong and within GBA. We see others who would like to see free flow of data within the whole of the GBA, and I think we need to work through these things. I think it's one of the most complex issues from a policy point of view that we need to figure out.
Dr. Lim, how is this evolving in Southeast Asia? I earlier mentioned one of the companies that's a unicorn that's often credited to Singapore, which is Trax, which is a retail data analytics company. This is a remarkable company that is headquartered in Singapore, but does most of its R&D, in Israel, founded by Israelis, and it serves businesses around the world in something like 50 markets around the world. That's amazing. That data is kind of flowing everywhere. Obviously, in Southeast Asia, you're looking at dealing with, in ASEAN, 10, 11 different markets. They've all got different rules, different sets of regulators, different concerns about data. Is the sort of ease with which data can flow back and forth in Southeast Asia, is that an advantage for Singapore? Or is the fact that the market is so fragmented and diverse an obstacle in some ways?
Good question. It's probably the latter. I think there's no global framework to address this issue of data flows. I mean, you have PDPA in Singapore, GDPR in Europe, and the US has its own set of systems. By and large, they are congruent. There are huge areas of overlap, but I don't think there's any framework that dictates or provides guidance on its actual flow. So a lot of it is, in military terms, you would call this a movement to contact. I mean, you try to push the envelope, and then you see what you come up against. But certainly on our end, we are not in Singapore. We are not, limiting the ability of technology companies to share data across international boundaries. Edwin, would you agree?
Yeah, thanks, Jui. Maybe to jump in on that point, because I think this issue of sort of global data standards or even regional data standards, to some extent, it's only of interest to government policymakers, analysts, and journalists. To be honest with you, I think from an entrepreneur's point of view, it's just one additional factor, a hurdle, a challenge. Maybe it could even be a defensive moat, right, for that company to really scale and to grow. So I'll share with you an example of another unicorn that came out of a lab in Singapore. It's called PetSnap. It's founded by a Malaysian, studied in Singapore, and his solution, or PetSnap solution, is essentially a very clever way to mine the intellectual property data sets, or whether of big corporates or of governments, right? And it's a sort of AI-enabled software that allows users to quickly spot, where the concentration of IP is and where there are gaps, etc. And it's an enterprise tech company. So this is a company that succeeded starting from Singapore, but first went to Suzhou in China, where they got access to some very good talent, and then started selling their solutions globally to the UK, to the US, and so on. And by the way, this happened over the past 10 years or so, right? So I don't know the details, and I think, I don't know whether Jeffrey is in the audience somewhere, maybe, or someone from PetSnap can chime in, but I suspect this issue of a global standard for data, or for privacy for that matter, didn't really come up much. It was more a case of what was it that their customers needed? How can I deliver this solution to generate value for my customer? How do I then get my pound of flesh so that I can reward my shareholders? I think if we were to go down to this level of conversation and to have our startups appreciate what the opportunities are and the challenges are, I think that will be something that will make a difference in a lot of our entrepreneurs.
One of the things that I find so fascinating about what's happening in Southeast Asia, particularly right now, and a lot of it is taking place right in Singapore, is that we're starting to see these really interesting mix-ups on the venture investor side. Silicon Valley and Sand Hill Road, they kind of monopolize the investment opportunities in the United States market for the most part. In China now, we're moving away from foreign capital being the source of funding for most of the local startups, and there's a lot more kind of homegrown venture funding. But in Southeast Asia, everybody's investing from everywhere. I mean, you've got Indian companies that are investing. You've got lots of Japanese companies, for example, that have invested in Grab. You have these kind of strange, mixes and matches where companies from China that are blood rivals, and in the same space, are willing to team up and invest with each other behind a Southeast Asian startup. What implications does that have for innovation, and particularly, Dr. Lim, the idea of deep tech? Does that help Singapore get access to new types of knowledge that it might not otherwise get?
Well, I'm not sure if it helps us. Look, I mean, by our working definition, deep tech is something that requires a high degree of specialization at the point of invention and at the point of application. I mean, if you look at it, AI systems, I mean, its practice also requires specialists. If you look at the production of mRNA vaccines, I mean, whether it's at the invention stage or the application stage, you require a high degree of specialization. So, you'd asked a question earlier about how Singapore and Hong Kong can collaborate. I think in so far as deep tech is concerned, these are areas in which both territories excel at, primarily because of the strength of the research systems, the university systems in the two countries. Now, beyond that, of course, Australia and New Zealand are important epicenters in cutting-edge technologies, cutting-edge research. So, the greater the throughput and the exchange of information, the better. But certainly, even with if you look at medicine, for instance, at some point, you need to put theory into practice, and you want to be able to try new medicines, test their safety and efficacy across as diverse a population as possible. To prove, I think that's critical, right? And that's where Southeast Asia would be a very, very interesting place for healthcare startup companies, for instance, just because of the diversity of the population. So, I think, especially for us, like I said before, I mean, it's global by nature, and it's a good thing.
I'm struck listening to Dr. Lim's answer there with the incredible focus on deep tech and how, this is something that's really characteristic of Singapore, is that government planners will kind of identify certain sectors that they think have got real potential, need capital, need support, and not only bring together other investors, but are putting up a lot of government money directly, trying to actively connect them with the right resources from the academic community. It's a very hands-on kind of activist approach, and Hong Kong does a lot of things that are similar in a lot of similar areas, but has generally been described as kind of more laissez-faire and a little more hands-off on that. As you study the Singapore approach, are there things there that Hong Kong finds attractive or interesting, would like to emulate, or do you see the approaches, the philosophies staying relatively different?
Well, inevitably, we look at cities around the world, countries around the world, and what their approaches are, and what we can learn, and what can be replicated. Obviously, between Hong Kong and Singapore, there's a difference in sort of philosophy, government approach. As you say, slightly more interventionist in Singapore, a little bit more directive, activist, to use your word. But if we look at the innovation and technology agenda in Hong Kong, as we heard a little bit earlier for those in Hong Kong, over the last 4 years or so, there's been a very concerted effort by the government to spur the development of the innovation and technology sector. 110 billion Hong Kong dollars pumped into what's going on, a focus on AI, robotics, on fintech, on biotech, on smart cities. So whilst it is not to the same degree as Singapore, I think there are some similarities between the Hong Kong approach, with a recognition that the government needs to play an active role in nudging the market along, is the way I would describe it. I think there are pros and cons to both approaches. I can argue either way. School of hard knocks, survival of the fittest in the sort of laissez-faire system, versus perhaps a little bit more benign support in another system.
We've got just a few minutes. Want to look at our questions here. We've got one from a certain observer named Leo. I think I know who this is. He's interested to know about the opportunities for large companies. We've talked a lot about startups. We've talked a lot about venture investors. I think this is Leo Zhang from Huawei. But he's curious to know, what is it that big companies can do to help support and be involved in this ecosystem? Edwin, Dr. Lim, either of you want to take a crack at that? A lot of big companies obviously mobilizing in the Singapore venture scene these days.
Yeah, I'll jump in and have a go at this, but maybe before that, to the earlier point about the different systems, I'm reminded of what Deng Xiaoping said, right? About it doesn't matter about the color of the cat so long as it catches mice. And I think even here in Singapore, we are also learning to be less interventionist or activist and to work with the market. Venture capital is a good example. For us in Singapore, as a government official, to try and claim to pick winners, to know how to pick the best winners, that's a shot to nothing. It's silly for us to even try to pretend that. What we then try to do instead is to co-invest with, alongside VCs, corporates, people who do this for every day as part of their day job. And we then work with them to catalyze more of such third-party monies to come in, and hopefully they will be the ones who can help bring the startup all the way to a successful exit. And coming back to Leo's question, and I think that's really the role that I think big companies can play. And I was very impressed this morning by what was shared with us about Huawei's plan with Sparks, as well as the cloud services that they're launching. I think if they can combine the typical strengths of a large corporate, right, the industrial capacity, the resources, the market channels, go-to-market channels, if they can combine this and offer it as a platform for hungry, smart entrepreneurs to really take advantage of, I think they can help to speed up the time to market, speed up the product market fit that much more, and increase the likelihoods of the startup's survival. On the flip side, I think we all recognize that, the old days of, Big Blue, hiring all these smart engineers, doing everything in-house, developing the next big thing in-house, and then still hoping to win in a globalized world, those days are gone. So big corporates all recognize that they need to have an open innovation approach. They need to be able to focus on what they're good at, right? Understanding their markets, their channels, and then bringing in crowdsource talented engineers, scientists, graphic designers, calligraphers, anyone who can help them grow their sales and to make their shareholders happy. And I think this is a perfect example of a win-win situation where I think big companies, wherever they are based, it's a shout out to them. They're welcome to sort of come and approach anyone else, obviously, in Singapore. We are very keen to see how we can harness this open innovation movement to help startups, not just from Singapore, but from all around the world, to have this sort of product market fit.
It's a great thought to end on. Yeah, Dr. Lim, go ahead. Very briefly, we're right on time.
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's almost standard operating procedure for us now. I mean, when we look at an opportunity or as we help companies to grow, we almost par for the course. We bring in corporate partners because that provides a degree of scale and reality testing that wouldn't otherwise exist for the startups.
It's really interesting to be able to hear from three people who are so actively involved in building these ecosystems and the various types of infrastructure that make them work. It's a fascinating time to be in both cities. I want to thank you both, and with that, we will join for lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Clay.
That concludes our very first panel discussion. A very big thank you to our moderator, Mr. Clay Chandler. And over here as well, I want to say a very big thank you to Dr. Lim, SGInnovate, and Mr. Chow as well, Enterprise Singapore. Can we give our speakers a big round of applause? Thank you so much for joining us for the first panel discussion of today. Thank you.